Hi everybody, good morning. That was a great talk, and this is a fascinating panel, and I'm excited to be part of it. Hopefully I can add a little bit to what everybody else will be talking about. So this talk is the first tentative steps of a new project that I'm beginning, perhaps at a preliminary stage even to be presenting to the public, but I couldn't pass up the opportunity to participate in the symposium. So please forgive me if my comments are scattered or not fully formed at this stage. I'm interested in the current absence of emotional and affective connections to energy and other resource consumption in the dominant stream of American culture and life, its presence in subcultural pockets, the imagination of such connections in literature and art, and how they might be encouraged in the future, primarily through design, policy, and radical politics. And as with many of you, when I say future, I mean right now. For as it's becoming increasingly clear, the consequences of our actions are not nearly so distant, nor unimaginable as we once thought or perhaps hoped. This project is motivated, as so many of us are here today at the symposium, by the energy and environmental crises that we're facing, and the transitions and transformations that seem to be, or that we might hope are, just around the bend. So much of what's new and what I hope is to come is a reconstruction of what was old and has been almost forgotten. For almost all human beings, for most of human history, and indeed for most of prehistory, until very recently, perhaps the last 150 years, a close relationship with and awareness of our connection to the world around us did not require an education in ecology or in energy humanities, but was necessary for daily life. I'm sure this is not new information for most of you. You don't need an understanding of photosynthesis or energy density to know that the sun is the basic element of life, for example. Human beings are tool makers, though we're not the only tool makers. And until the 18th or 19th century, it was almost impossible for people to be unaware of the resources and energy use measured in human and animal work that went into providing their tools, be they flint arrows, copper axes, or cloaks of woven grass. With the growth of trade from distant regions and finally the harnessing of ancient sunlight in the form of fossil fuels, such an awareness has grown distant. By the 20th century, living as we do within an ecology of oil, and cheap oil, Americans, the citizens of Western industrialized nations, and increasingly elites and others, at some point perhaps everyone around the world, will be able to live as if energy and resources simply did not matter. So I've written a fair amount about recent concerns in this area over energy depletion or peak oil in the mid-2000s. This is the subject of a couple articles I've published and a forthcoming book, which is coming out next spring. Right now the title is Peak Politics, Resource Scarcity, and Libertarian Political Culture in the U.S., and I need a better title, so if anybody has any suggestions, I'm happy to crowdsource this information. But while popular fears about energy depletion, or perhaps anxieties and sometimes even dreams, were, I think, misguided in certain ways, I have no question that the future most human beings face will be quite different from the last century. The future in which most people on this planet will become, by necessity or by choice, far more aware of the energy and resource consumption. And of course, the difference between necessity and choice is a quite large one. Ultimately, this project will look at literary and artistic imaginations of potential alternative effective energy landscapes, sociological studies of individual and groups who are already feeling energy, such as the peak oil believers I studied, and hypermilers, or folks who utilize various methods to wring every last mile per gallon out of their automobiles, and the potential contributions of eco-design, such as appliances with energy meters, and of course responsible energy and environmental policy itself. To that end, I want to present to you today two short examples, a work of literature pointing a way forward, if not the way forward, and something slightly more tangible. So I found Paolo Bacigalupi's novel, The Wind-Up Girl, which is published in 2009, to be one of the most thoughtful explorations of energy futures out there. And I assigned one of the short stories of Bacigalupi's short stories in the CENHS class that I'm teaching next semester. I'm sorry, this semester. To give you a sense of the Wind-Up Girl, for those of you that have not read the novel, it's set in 23rd century Thailand, which is one of the few nations which has survived becoming a failed state amidst rising seas and extreme weather events which have sunk metropolises such as New York, New Orleans, and Mumbai, a global contraction resulting from petroleum scarcity, and agricultural plagues stemming from corporate control of genetically engineered sterile seeds. Its title refers to its protagonist, Amiko, a humanoid new person created by Japanese genetic engineers to serve as soldiers and slaves, which I'm sure Tim Morton would enjoy discussing her potential subjectivity. And the Wind-Up Girl is in some ways a successor to William Gibson's Neuromancer in its dense, vibrant prose and the richness and complexity of its vision. The novel has much to offer to discussions such as ours, including skillful complications of critical concepts such as nature and culture, the nation-state in the age of globalization, especially in the context of global environmental phenomena such as climate change and climate migration, the relationship between spirituality and technology, and the unavoidable contradictions between capitalism and sustainability. What makes it relatively unique is the centrality of energy in its speculative vision. There have been no shortage of English language novels and films that have portrayed different energy and environmental futures over the last decade, of course, whether they're based on peak oil, climate change, or something entirely different. Almost every vision, from Kim Stanley Robinson's trilogies to Avatar, touch on the subject of energy in some way. However, most offer little detail, and few imagine the kind of radically altered relationship with and awareness of energy itself that the Wind-Up Girl highlights. In its future, the world has undergone a contraction of global trade and travel due to fossil fuel depletion, and there are strictly enforced national and individual limits on carbon emissions. Although fossil fuels are still used here and there, human beings have primarily returned to a somatic energy regime, once again dependent on human and animal muscle. To augment human work, which Pascaluppi refers to as the jewels of men, scientists have resurrected 15-foot elephants from the Pleistocene to wind kink springs that serve as energy storage units. And this is a depiction of the so-called megadonts in the novel. In such a world, where air conditioning, which is obviously something crucial here in Houston, is provided by human arms winding the conditioning springs early in the morning, the cost of energy consumption are no longer mystified. One early passage in the novel describes the gene-hacked animals in a kink spring factory, for example. The main flywheels spin up and the factory shivers as gears beneath the floor engage, the floorboards vibrate, kinetic power sparks through the system like adrenaline, a tingling anticipation of the energy about to be put into the manufacturing line. The megadon screams protest and flash into silence. The whine of the flywheels rises to a howl and then cuts off as jewels gush into the drive system. In this passage, we see, in a nicely literalized depiction, the common metaphorical usage of energy as an active, vigorous dynamism. In a similar way, the environmental consequences of carbon consumption become much more palpable. Whereas few of us have any conception of the amount and source of energy our digital devices, appliances, and airplanes actually consume, the characters in The Wind-Up Girl can't help but connect each blinking light to the rising ocean that threatens to engulf their city. Without fossil fuels, the iPods and MacBooks have gone silent, and when one character comes upon a room of working computers, one of the few left in the world, the narrator notes that the amount of power burning through them makes Kanya weak in the knees. She can almost see the ocean rising in response. It's a horrifying thing to stand beside. The horror and dread of anthropogenic climate change in this passage is not vividly imagined, but embodied, which Pascaluppi emphasizes by highlighting the character's physical position in relation to machines. These connections are encouraged in the novel by religious practices. The environmental ministry, for example, has its own shrines around Bangkok, and one of the most popular religious figures is a biodiversity martyr, which to me recalls the prayers of the eco-cult God's Gardeners in Margaret Atwood's Mad Adam trilogy. The radical shift in awareness of energy and environment that we see, as this passage shows, an understanding that is effective and not merely intellectual, corporeal, as well as rational, could certainly be seen as a harbinger of things to come. And perhaps works of imaginative fiction such as The Wind-Up Girl might even encourage such connections. Indeed, part of my research trajectory for this project includes studying book clubs that are reading works such as this to evaluate this prospect for myself. In The Wind-Up Girl, unlike more utopian environmental imaginaries, this transformation occurs not by choice, but by necessity. The siege threatened to overwhelm Bangkok, as they have other major port cities, and severe energy rationing is now in effect. So the key for us here in 2014 is to collect lessons not only from the past, which many of us are used to doing in our teaching and our writing, but from possible futures as well, as Judy Natal was suggesting yesterday, and develop similar alternative affective energy landscapes before we ourselves face such hardships. While such an effective connection between energy consumption and its environmental consequences might seem like it would stretch the effective imaginations and capabilities of most Americans, not least because of the cognitive dissonance between our immersion in the current fossil fuel regime and the emotional and psychological toll of an unceasing awareness of future bringing being, which I think ties in nicely with the last paper. I think this is not entirely the case. In my work on the subculture and politics of American hardcore peak oil believers in the mid to late 2000s, I explored the ideology and actions of Americans who developed such connections. Here's a close-up of this guy's picture, this guy's t-shirt rather. These Americans based not only important life decisions on the threat of oil depletion and climate change, but adopted a dissident ideology in which such alternative affective landscapes became realized and reinforced in daily practice. They thus formed a radical and dissident emotional habitus, which, as Debbie Gould put it, drawing on Bourdieu and Norbert Elias, contains an emotional pedagogy, a template for what and how to feel, in part by conferring on some feelings and modes of expression an axiomatic natural quality. These currently outlaw emotions, to borrow a phrase from Alison Jagar, have a tendency to take root in enabling social conditions. A number of older people believers, for example, first developed their energetic tendencies during the oil crises of the 1970s, when Americans were encouraged to be aware and concerned about energy consumption, both as citizens and consumers. Such a historical perspective is, of course, a useful reference for our anticipation of future developments, and questions about the plausibility of, or indeed, as I'm suggesting here, the inevitability of future affective shifts might be answered by the work of historians of emotion, such as Peter Stearns, Barbara Rosenzweig, and William Reddy, who have shown that feelings and emotions are far from timeless and universal. Similarly, cultural historians such as Elizabeth Cohen have documented the sometimes reluctant spread of the consumer ethic in the post-World War II United States, which is a vast ideological, private, and public relations campaign to reverse the parsimony of Americans who came of age during the Great Depression. In addition to so-called peakists, hypermilers, drivers who use ingenious and often dangerous methods to wring each last mile per gallon out of their automobiles, for example by ridge riding, coasting, and even drafting behind large trucks, are another site of dissident affective landscapes. Sharing best practices on subcultural websites and meeting in fuel efficiency challenges, hypermilers compete to use less oil, although their motivations for doing so often vary. Some, like Wayne Gertis, who began scrimping and saving after 9/11 and redoubled his efforts after becoming aware of anthropogenic climate change a couple of years later, are a case study in the potential positive feedback loop between material practices and effective imaginations. I'm not just doing this for myself, Wayne told reporter Dennis Gaffney in a 2008 Mother Jones article, although he had in fact started doing it for himself. I'm doing this for my country and the world. On websites and forums, hypermilers shared not only strategies for economical motoring, but an energy ethic more appropriate to the Anthropocene, through descriptions and images of the hero and or jerk of the day, for example. And this is an image from a couple weeks ago, and I can swear that I've seen this on the highway here in Houston. Reading Elizabeth Colbert's recent book on mass extinctions, I was reminded that upon the detonation of the first atomic bomb in New Mexico in 1945, J. Robert Oppenheimer, another American acting for his country, claimed that a line from the Bhagavad Gita sprung to mind: "I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." With only mild rhetorical exaggeration, I would submit that this is an appropriate sentiment for the Anthropocene. In our daily actions, in our energy choices, in our steady but substantial contributions, we are contributing to the destruction of worlds big and small, near and far, human and non-human, existing and still to come. This is a fact, but for most of us, for reasons that sociologists, social psychologists, and nonfiction authors have documented for a decade or two now, it enters into our minds and our bodies only in fleeting moments. The newspaper headline on climate change or species extinction that causes a deep sadness, a muscle tightening that's quickly, if only temporarily relieved by turning to the sports section or the Sunday style section. As eco-psychologists and effective theorists can attest, this awareness is lodged in our bodies, in our muscles and our nerves, and presents us with two options, to act or to turn away, which is itself, of course, a kind of action. If politics is where the ultimate solution lies, a first step, I would suggest, is in internalizing the externalities, as the economists are fond of saying. Only by internalizing and embodying the power and great peril of the Anthropocene will we be sufficiently motivated to mount the kinds of collective actions necessary to effect any real change. The potential of networks to spread alternative affective landscapes, a question posed yesterday, has been, I would argue, an understudied aspect of social movement studies, either in sociology or history, and I would submit to you that social movement studies, or more broadly, the practical understanding of how change happens, needs to be a more central concern of energy and environmental humanities moving forward. As a result of the copious work on crowd psychology and the influence of affect study scholars such as Teresa Brennan, the author of The Transmission of Affect, we tend to think of affect spreading through face-to-face interactions, but it should go without saying that digital networks offer ample possibilities as well. In my book on peak oil subcultures, I critique the metaphor of the crowd as a depiction of the virtual experience, but the collective encouragement and construction of outlaw emotions, the transmission of what might be termed an energy descent affect, goes a long way towards answering one of the most fundamental questions that remains for me from that work, which is how so many people or believers radically altered their lives, purchasing land, leaving partners, leaving jobs, in preparation for the impending collapse, despite never having met another people or believer in person in the real world. One explanation relies on the rational, isolated individual gathering information and taking action, but perhaps the spread of affect, even across fiber optic network cables, is a more compelling picture. While discussing Carrie Norgaard's book, Living in Denial, Climate Change, Emotions, and Everyday Life, with the students in my Energy Humanities class this semester, I posed to them the following question, one of the many impossible questions that I posed to them. Given the stubborn cultural norms that Carrie Norgaard emphasizes, all of which lead us to turn away and ignore ongoing environmental crises, norms that instruct us, for example, about what to pay attention to, what to discuss in different social situations, and what to allow ourselves to become emotional about. I asked the students how we break out of this cage, as individuals and as a society. One of the more thoughtful responses, I thought, came from Allie Porter, who said that Norgaard was basically describing peer pressure, and that the way to dissent is to start the trend. If environmental concern and action becomes a trend, the dynamic would change. People would be able to truly make a difference in these large groups. Basically, she said, one must play the game of peer pressure to encourage others to change the dynamic and fix the problem of climate change. While I might choose slightly different terms, I think that Allie was on something. We tended to view the various options of environmental action according to the model of individual subjectivity, shaped by Cartesian dualism and neoliberal politics, ignoring the cultural and subcultural fabrics that knit us together and perpetuate normative and often automatic material practices. In this light, and especially given the similarities between this subject and the later panel on communicating climate futures, I want to suggest that the spread or transmission of affect, the way that energy and environmental emotions and affects are constructed, maintained, and circulated between individuals might be one especially fruitful area for us to explore as a group today.